Welcome to more Altered Base Set card reviews. This time we're going to have the Yzmir spells and permanents, which is probably the most of them because if I recall correctly, Yzmir has the fewest characters. So we'll have the most to go through for a spell and permanent video. Starting off here we have Boom coming from the Axiom faction, and you can sacrifice a character to discard target character or permanent. This is the same effect as Banishing Gate, but you get a 1 mana discount and you have to sacrifice a character. Sacrificing a character to get a 1 mana discount is probably not a great deal overall. It means it's kind of a break even on the value, but in addition to being a break even on the value, it means you can only play this at specific times because you need a character that is a 2/2 or a 1/1 to play this. But those restrictions only apply if your hero is not helping out. This card works very differently in Lindiwe because Lindiwe can use the token to do this, just getting rid of the token, and also Lindiwe gets 2 boosts for doing this. So it gives you kind of a reward for playing into the restriction in Lindiwe. However, Banishing Gate usually doesn't even cost a rare point. I will give this a C to reflect that it's not very good in the heroes that are a bit stronger. It's close to a D maybe. I also don't like that you have to pay the Robin Hood tax twice if you use this to destroy Robin Hood. That's kind of a problem. However, this is a way to increase the total number of discard target characters in your deck, which, if that effect proves to be very good, it is very powerful to both remove something and sabotage it preemptively. Maybe you want a 4th, 5th, or 6th ability to do that. Brassbug Hive. So this is the common version of the Axiom Brassbug Hive, but it's available in Yzmir. You get a 2/2 robot when you play this, but if you're spending 5 mana on a 2/2 robot, usually that isn't any different from getting a 0/0/0. You're probably getting 2 the turn you develop this, but for the rest of the game, maybe it switches some of your 1/1s to 2/0s, and maybe it switches some of your complete losses to 1/1s. I think it's a tough sell because the Brassbugs are pretty small. The rare Brassbug Hive that makes 3/3s is where it is kind of the break point where a permanent feels like it's making enough of an impact. So I'm going to give this a D. And I think given that these are so small, they're pretty likely to just win the lane because you removed everything else in the lane, so I'd usually prefer the Ortis Carrier that we'll get to later. Helping Hand. Target character gains 1 boost and loses fleeting. So this goes really well with this Seasoned we saw in the faction that we mentioned Aphanis would be interested in, because if you lose fleeting on something that's Seasoned and getting played the second time, you can go and play it a 3rd time. It's not quite as good as Anchored because you have to pay for it again, but this is a pretty good rate to be getting the trigger, and Aphanis is probably not going to be able to turn his nose up at this because of the way it enables those cards. Although Aphanis had a lot of rare characters he wanted, so maybe this is hard. I'll go ahead and give this an A. I think it's so cheap you probably do play it. It's like 1 mana for a 2/2 in Aphanis specifically. That makes it kind of more compelling than just playing a character. Sometimes you would be worried that a spell like this doesn't have anything to go onto, which makes it worse than playing a character, but 1 is so cheap that it mitigates that concern a lot. And Afanis probably plays a lot of cheap characters to help out. Intimidation. Return target character or permanent with hand cost 5 or less to its owner's hand. I actually like this way less in the Yzmir faction than I do in the Bravos faction. I think Akesha would like to completely run the opponent out of resources until they're having unimpressive turns. So letting your opponent reuse a card is really threatening to that. And on the other hand, Afanis probably would like to spend the rare points on the Anchored effect, Lose Fleeting effects, all these force multipliers for the really stacked boosted characters. It's easy for those characters to be bigger than something that costs 5 or less. At which point, the support for them to play them one additional time or anchor them one additional time might be better. Especially since occasionally these kinds of spells don't have any target at all. Occasionally, your opponent just plays 2s and 3s all day. I'm gonna give this a D. Ride the Bifrost. All characters you control switch expeditions. This is a very weird card. And I thought it was funny that there's kind of a same effect in the base set of Magic, which the devs of this game say they have a lot of inspiration from. And the one in the base set of Magic was not very good. I think this one's also not very good, although it's a lot better than that one. The problem is that all the characters you put in the other expedition are lost from the previous expedition, so it's kind of hard to get ahead with this. One thing that's interesting about this card is that it can be very good at accomplishing a 1/1, because you can develop multiple things to, say, your companion expedition. Say you play 2 things to your companion expedition. Your opponent plays 2 slightly larger things to that same expedition, and then you play this. That makes it so that this 1 2-cost card is putting 2 characters in the other lane. So you're getting like double the value in that other lane. You're just immediately losing a lane when you do it. Which means this card is really bad for winning both lanes, but it's pretty good at trying to just win one lane and forget about the other. You're losing the other. That means decks that get ahead would be more interested in it, which usually isn't Yzmir, so this is going to be a D. And even in those use cases, I think playing a card that is restricted to very late in the game is not going to be as flexible as just playing more characters or playing certain removals that are very good against specific things, other conditionals. Meditation Training. Target character with hand cost 3 or less gains Anchored. So this is a card that you can use on Kegir and Mage Dancer. You can use it on the Bravos Blade Dancer that you've been putting seasoned counters on. You can put it on anything that's too big for its weight class and get the benefit of using it multiple times. It is a little scary if the thing you use this on gets removed, but I think Afanis doesn't really have a way to like spread a wide board of medium things where none of them are a risk to get removed. So I think that's just a risk you kind of have to accept playing that style of deck. I'll give this an A for how we'll play in Afanis. I think Akesha will be significantly less interested in it because this doesn't really play the act-react game very well. It switches back to giving your opponent a lot of information, and it's not really necessary for her. She doesn't have as many 6/6/6s that are juicy to anchor. Beauty Sleep. Target character gains a sleep. This one is interesting to evaluate because it's very powerful on the last turn of the game still, like in Muna. But I think I'm a little more concerned about paying the back half of it than in Muna. Muna develops into such a good late game that paying the back half is fine, but I wonder if Afanis would prefer cheaper costs all around to keep the boost counters flowing. I'm still going to give this an A. It's kind of like downgraded from an A plus in Muna down to an A in Yzmir. I think Akesha is likely to want it too. Akesha can kind of use her ability to try to keep this in hand longer to get it to be used on the last turn of the game. Or maybe the last turn of the game that matters, because we're going to cover One Jump Ahead, which is a very crazy card. Or, not One Jump Ahead, different game. Small Step, Giant Leap. Which can end the game early, so you could use this as part of a closing suite, a set of cards that are closing the game out for you. Occasionally, you can also use this on your own Mage Dancers. It's a little unusual for your Mage Dancers to be losing because they're supposed to get pretty big. But if they are losing, you get an entire additional turn of use out of them if you sleep your own Mage Dancer. Celebration Day. Expeditions can't move forward this day. I think there's not enough of any kind of permanent engine or any kind of reason the 9-mana turn is going to be different from the 8-mana turn for you to want to play an entire card to kick the can down the road. Yzmir is like kind of weirder, which makes me wonder in some ways whether there's something I'm missing. But I don't think this is going to work, so I'm going to give it a D. This is a very unique effect. Grand Endeavor. Target expedition moves forward one region. So this would be one of those examples of something that is providing a lot of permanent benefit under a celebration day. However, I think Grand Endeavor is a little bit weak, and I think it's even weaker in Yzmir than in Ortis, because I think the need to lose expeditions when you play this and then not have a permanent effect that helps you not lose expeditions the very next turn is just a lot of advancement for your opponent, which gives your opponent a lot of ways to figure out how to close the game even without removing this. Even just by getting just one more 2-0 it's very possible that your opponent just gets one or two 2-0s. So 2-0 the turn this comes out, a 2-0 right after because this didn't increase your defense. And you know, you don't get to use this many times because the game has ended. Ortis Carrier. Create a Ortis recruit 1/1/1 soldier in your companion expedition. I like this card a bit more in Yzmir than I like it in Ortis because it kind of provides a way to win a lane if you end up removing everything from that lane, which happens some amount of the time. And that happens less in the faction this comes from. I also think Yzmir would be more likely to kind of give up on winning some of the earlier turns, whereas Ortis has really strong characters where when you play this on turn 1 or turn 2, that can represent a turn that you could have done really well on. Because the Yzmir characters are small and a lot of the benefit is from like, you know, playing a Banishing Gate on a 5-cost card because your opponent put 5-cost cards in their deck. You have to wait till later in the game to do that. So it's possible that Yzmir wouldn't have been successful on the turn you developed this, so you didn't really lose as much. So I'll give this a B. But it's possible we just shouldn't be playing permanents at all. In some senses, every advancement is a permanent in Altered, because it makes a number of advancements you need to do for the rest of the game lower, which kind of is almost like all of your characters having slightly higher biome stats, because the arrangement that they're required to meet is less strong. So I'm not convinced that we will be playing this. Magical Training. Draw a card. This is an A just for Aphanis, because you lose like nothing when you play this in Aphanis. You still have an entire additional card in your hand. Now the second, so you get a 1/1/1, which is just like playing an Orders Recruit, and then you have a new card in your hand, which an Orders Recruit wouldn't give you. And then you have this in reserve. Now in reserve, it's not as useful because it costs 3. And so that's a little tricky to use. But if the game has slowed down, paying 3 could be okay. And more importantly, you can find ways to discard this from reserve for a benefit. It appears on, I think there's like Rare Hathor can return this to your hand from reserve, and from there you could mana zone it. There's other things you can do. But it's still an A because even if we just discard the 3 cost from reserve because we can't find a way to do something useful with it, it's still break even in Aphanis because you get the 1/1/1 buff counter and you put it wherever you want, and you pass priority to see what your opponent is going to do, and you have an entire new card in your hand to replace the card you lost. So you were definitely made whole. This is going to be a D because I think you should play the common. I think even if you feel like you don't have any of those other solutions I mentioned and you're going to play Magical Training twice only when you pay the cost printed on the second part of the card, I think playing Magical Training the second time means that something is going on in the game where you feel okay about doing that. And if you feel okay about doing that, the difference between 2 mana and 3 mana probably isn't a big deal. It's probably you anchored something really big in your companion expedition and it doesn't need any help, and you can just like tap a ton of mana to prepare for next turn, and you're giving up on the other expedition. Pretty plausible. So let's save the rare points here. Gift of Self. Sacrifice a character. If you do, draw 2 cards. So this can be used on a character that is losing a lane anyway. That is also true of Boom to some extent, although if the location your small character is in the same place as the thing you would want to remove, it might like cancel out. Whereas here, you're never getting a lane winning resource, so it will never cancel out in that way. You add a lot of cards to your hand, but you lose a character, although you possibly only lose half the character if you are playing the character a second time. This could get you into a position later in the game where you have way more mana orbs than your opponent because you've just drawn so many cards after going card for card with your opponent. But it is a little bit costly because you are spending 2 mana and you're not adding position to the board the turn you play this. You're only losing position. Hopefully you're losing position on an expedition that you're giving up on as you remove the character, but you're still not adding anything. However, Aphanis is adding something because Aphanis is adding a boost. I think this is one of the best ways to draw cards in the set, because you're getting 2 cards for 2 mana. That's kind of the best rate we've seen in the set. It is timing specific, so we can't just draw these 2 cards whenever we want. We have to draw it at specific times, but getting a full mana discount for that makes it worth it. I'm going to give this an A. We'll see how it actually plays. And this is good in both Akesha and Aphanis because in Akesha, using the After You ability should give you more information about whether or not it's time to give up on a lane. So it improves her ability to play this on any turn of the game, even if your opponent hasn't been able to play a lot of cheap cards that round. Sacrifice a character if you do draw 3 cards, and we pay a little more. I think rare points are really precious, and even though paying more mana to get more cards is reasonable, I think spending a rare point for a side grade, even in a deck that develops to create an understanding that the 3 cards is way better, it's not going to be worth the side grade. It's going to be better to, add the draw a card effect to one of your characters or something. Sometimes that's available. So I'm gonna give this a D, that we should be playing the common version. But if the common version somehow didn't exist, this would have some of the same dynamics. Off you go. Send to reserve target character with hand cost 3 or less. This is kind of a marquee card from the starter deck gameplay, and I think it will continue to be good later on. I'm going to give this an A. This is always just trading up on mana if the 3-cost card is just like worth 3, and then if a 3-cost card is worth even more than 3 because it has lots of buffs on it or anything like that, maybe even just because it's unique and that tends to be really strong, the 4 costs can be a reasonable trade too. And if we're having trouble getting value out of the 4 costs, those solutions that try to utilize cards in reserve without playing them are something you would want to look into. But again, similar to Magical Training, if we have to discard this from reserve because the backside is cumbersome, it's already pulling its weight. This one costs more and hits higher things, a lot higher things. The cost is increased, or the hand cost it can hit is increased by 2. I'm going to give this a D because I think it will be better to include some of the unconditional removals to pair with this. And that way you can use the 2 against 3 dynamic of the card. You're kind of completely losing the ability to spend only 2 to remove a 3 when you get this. And in exchange you get 3 to remove a 5, but some people don't even prefer to have 5s in their deck. So you're getting instead maybe 3 to remove a 4, and then we're side grading for a rare, right? We don't want to side grade for a rare point, right? So that's the way I would think about it. Spycraft. Sabotage, then resupply. So this gets you 2 halves of a card. It makes your opponent lose one of their halves, and then you get a random half. The half your opponent loses is probably going to be like better than an average card because you're picking when you play this, and you're picking which card in reserve to hit. However, I prefer Tooth Fairy over this effect because this card doesn't add presence to the board. And cantrip cards, even when they, replace themselves well enough, you're kind of hiding the resupply card underneath this Spycraft, and that can make your curve more awkward and make you fail to find specific character cards that have specific costs as you're trying to develop the early steps of the game, which would be the same cost on a card like Gift of Self, but Gift of Self is going to get you ahead, so you're paying that cost for a strong benefit. Here you're just paying that cost for this kind of break-even effect. One way of thinking about that would be, do you want to disrupt yourself a little bit to disrupt your opponent a lot? I'm not sure you do. You do disrupt your opponent more than you disrupt yourself because you're skipping one draw until you've played this to see your resupply, whereas you are looking at everything that your opponent drew all game and picking the most important thing to remove the second play from. This the entire package hasn't convinced me, and we can play characters at Sabotage. I think that's the better way to do it. I wouldn't be surprised if this was good, though. I wouldn't be surprised if, you know, this turns out to be the way to do the sabotaging. Especially in Afanis, who does get, like, 1 boost. So let's give this a C. That's the overall take. Sabotage, then resupply, and it costs no additional mana the first time. And there was only a first time last time, right? Yeah, I had fleeting. Oh, that is the same text though. It just looks different because the fleeting line is removed. So we're just getting a second play of this card. I think paying 3 is a little ponderous. I think if this was a common, this would kind of draw us in. But 3 is a little expensive, and something to notice here is that the first time you play it, you're going to add something to your reserve, and this will go into reserve with it. So your reserve is getting very, very full, and the risk that you have to discard a card from your reserve is getting very, very appreciable. So Akesha's strategy of trying to eke out an advantage on cards and get to a point where only one player is playing cards, against other people playing that strategy, discarding so many cards from your reserve might put you back. I would just play the common version here. Let's say this is AD. Conjuring Seal. Draw 2 cards. This is the more direct, straightforward way to draw cards. I think the requirements and then advantages offered by Gift of Self is better than this. And in 39 card decks, I think after you add 3 Gift of Self, you'll be like loaded up on card draw. So I'm going to posit that this is a D, and that we will be doing Gift of Self things, or we'll be removing our opponent's characters, and we're not going to do this. It's just a little expensive, and other options have been offered to us. I can imagine if we didn't have the other options that maybe we would play this in Akesha, so that after we try to drain our opponent of resources, we make sure we have our own. This one draws 3 cards. I think it's kind of a similar case. This one might be more promising because I think 3. I like the 4 do nothing better than the 3 do nothing, because I feel like anything more than 2 do nothing is already just like watch your opponent's companion marker move. So I do like this, but it's still a D. D+. Vanishing Gate. Discard target character or permanent, and this has fleeting. The rare version can be played a second time for a little more. I think the rare version is compelling, but it could flood the reserve if there's no sweet targets, and it costs an entire rare point. So I'm going to give this one an A. I could imagine playing fewer than the full 3, but I can't imagine not playing any, because this is really flexible. Whoopsies. It can be used to remove problematic permanents. It can be used to remove a unique and keep it from being played a second time. It can even be used on a 2-cost character when you have nothing else to play. Hopefully that's not the case, but it still is doing things when you have to use it that way. Whereas a card like Boom might not even be doing anything if you don't have anything big enough to remove. So this one is A. And this one is D. Small Step, Giant Leap. This is one of the strangest cards in this set. Target expedition moves forward 1 region. And we can do that a second time if we pay a rare point. This card resolves, this card causes an immediate check for the win condition. The win condition is checked continuously. So if this is played during an afternoon, your opponent can't advance their markers to create a tiebreaker or to win the game if you have already won the game with this card. However, to use this, you would have to use this to end the game, you would need to at least be at parity with your opponent. You actually don't even have to be ahead of your opponent, but you do have to at least be keeping up with them to where your things are almost touching each other. Unless you played 2 of them, but I think that's pretty hard. A lot of Yzmir decks seem to not necessarily be ahead of their opponent early, which might make you not want to play this card. The Mana Zone mechanic in Altered might make it possible that even if you're unreliable at getting ahead, you can afford to play 1 or 2 of these and just Mana Zone them when you're not getting ahead, and just try to keep your advancements up instead. This is a pretty good way of dealing with permanent-based decks like the Brassbug Hive deck, where later in the game they're consistently building boards that are too big for you to advance on even one lane, but they let you advance some to set that up. You can use those advancements they let you have to meet the condition of this immediately ending the game and immediately end the game. Overall, I'm going to give this a C in Yzmir. I think all 3 heroes aren't necessarily demonstrating a way to get ahead and use this. Even though this is, in Bravos, it would seem like this would just be bonkers and really strong and slam lots of games shut. But you have to consider how the faction actually plays, and a lot of times a character card, by winning a lane, reduces the number of expeditions you need to win by 1. And so it's possible that reliably doing that over and over again with your deck building choices is better than this weird special effect of getting your advancement and ending the game. Kraken's Wrath. Send to reserve up to 3 target characters with total hand cost 5 or less. For sake of completion, this is a D. This removes 3 characters, and the rare version removes 4 characters and increases the cost it could hit. But both of them are fleeting. Some people find this card appealing, but I haven't been able to be successful with it, and it kind of doesn't make sense to me, because it's very hard to pass so many times that your opponent has put 3 characters out there, and you have not had to spend down below 5 mana yet. Possibly that could happen due to like a bunch of Brassbug Hives maybe, but if there's a bunch of Brassbug Hives, then during deck building when I was worried about a bunch of Brassbug Hives, I probably would have added a permanent removal card that could have just stopped me from needing to pay 5 mana just to cancel it out. It's also going to be hard to play characters after you do this. So if say on like 7 mana orbs you go Magical Training, and then you go Magical Training, and then your opponent plays 3 characters, and then you're able to send all those characters to reserve, and then you can't play any of your own characters, then you took a big risk adding a 5-cost card to your deck. You also kind of You potentially have fewer plays the next turn. The magical trainings replace themselves, and then this was fleeting, so you can't play it again. But all the cards you sent to reserve can be played again. So you might be dealing with something the next turn. The Ortis Carrier supports this card really well. That is a way to resolve that question of how do you have enough mana left over to win a lane after you play this. However, I'd be worried about this being such a brick if I didn't draw the Ortis Carrier that particular game. And I'm still worried about the priority issue with my opponent having enough 3 costs out. So I'm going to give this a D. We'll see how it does later. And Akesha's after you does help with that priority problem, but this is 1 card trying to remove 3, and Akesha is 1 additional step. So it's like there's 2 steps left, and that's tricky. We'll say this is also D. Celestial Blast. Discard up to 2 targets, characters or permanents. This card is very risky to add to your deck because it costs 7, so it's not helping you play out your hand earlier in the game. It removes two permanents, 2 characters, or a character and a permanent. If you remove a character and a permanent, it probably means there's like another character, and that means you're losing advancement and you're not able to play a character to get your own advancement. So that doesn't seem very good. If you're removing 2 permanents, you're in a similar spot, except you might be losing advancements twice. So I think this makes the most sense when it is removing 2 characters and then neither player is advancing, or when you're removing 2 characters, at least the risk that 2 advancements are happening against you is significantly lower. So I think I wouldn't include this in my deck specifically for permanents because I can't construct a best case scenario against the permanents where it doesn't leave me worried. However, this has interesting implications if you do hit 2 characters without fleeting with it. You're drawing an entire card and you're moving up to 2 of your opponent's future plays while breaking even on biome stats because you removed their biome stats. So that is a way that you can get ahead in the game. I'm going to give this a D because the structure of a lot of decks is showing me a lot of boards with more than 2 things. So I feel the risk is painful here, and I'm really I would want to wait and see several games play out where I see boards with 2 big things, and then I feel okay adding this to my deck. It also has a little bit of a priority issue. I think not as bad as the Kraken's Wrath because you only need to find 1 cheap card instead of 2. But you do possibly need to play this on 8, play a 1 cost, use Akesha, and then play this to hit 2 things. That's something else to keep in mind. Am I counting that right? You go first, use Akesha, your opponent plays the thing, you play 1 cost. Yeah, you need a 1 cost to remove 2 mid-sized characters that are your opponent's play for the turn. Oh, they don't both say draw a card. Oh, I was a little confused due to the Ortis version. I already gave it a D, so it'll stay a D. I kind of wanted the card just for playing the common. Baba's Ispa. This draws a card when it comes in, and you can sacrifice a character to after you. So if the character is small enough This can give you an advantage determining what your opponent is going to do. And you can do this over and over again. In Lindiwe, this is going to generate 2 boosts on Maw every time you use it. Or you can just use Maw to after you, so you just actually become a Kesha in addition to being you get to choose between Akesha and Lindiwe on your turns, kind of, which is interesting. And on every character, it's giving you more ability to wait and see what your opponent is going to do. I think as a permanent that sacrifices a character, you're kind of going from needing to find 1 or 2 spots where you can safely sacrifice a character and going into needing to do it all the time, which is even harder to fulfill to get the full benefit of this card. It has like a similar amount of value to Ortis Carrier, but an Ortis Carrier that is missing some turns because there's a condition you need to meet would not be as good. With Ortis Carrier itself, it's a lot easier to do this repeatedly, but you can't always draw those 2 together. I'll give this a C. I think Lindiwe is going to play it. And it might surprise me in either Akesha, probably not in Aphanis, because Aphanis probably won't have enough characters. This will get the same grade. Oh wait, you can use this immediately. Oh, that's kind of interesting. Because it has the, you exhaust to use the after you effect, which means you can use it immediately the turn you play it. So possibly you could like find a way to win the turn you develop this by getting the benefit out of it and getting a reposition as you remove a character to like switch to the correct lane to be playing in. It's pretty interesting, but I'm going to give it the same grade of C. I guess just to say why that isn't enough. I think you still have to find a time to develop this. And it's not always going to be the case that the way, you know, the turn 3 or turn 4 board lines up offers you an ability to play this out. And if you're not able to do that and maintain a win on the same lane you're developing a permanent, and you spent the rare point without getting the benefit. And oftentimes having the flexibility to mana zone a permanent is kind of nice because they're not good in every phase of the game. And spending a rare point on a card that you mana zone a lot sometimes doesn't feel good. Ether Shard. At noon, draw a card. This is a D. I don't think this is good. I think this is very not good. I think if you play the other cards that draw cards temporarily, you will tend to play those cards and then hit the other cards that draw cards, and you'll continually be able to spend small installments of mana to draw more cards. And those small installments of mana you can use the cards that you got doing that to mana zone cards. And then after you mana zone cards, even if the total amount of cards, even if you have to play like 2 or 3 of these Gift Yourselves, or I can't remember what the other one was called. Let's learn it right now. Conjuring Seal. Even if you have to play several Gift of Self or several Conjuring Seal, because you're able to use the cards you drew right away from the first few into your mana zone, you can afford to pay 6, 7, or 8 total cost from playing those several times. So I would always prefer to do that instead of developing the Ether Shard. And then the Ether Shard can even be removed as an additional liability that the spells don't have. So this is a D in my grade. This one draws a card immediately, and then we'll draw a card at noon. This is a D. I think the common is probably better here, because the common already develops drawing a dramatic number of cards, and you will get to see at least one card before you're able to use your mana again, so the immediacy here is not that big a deal. Kadagir, Yzmir Bastion. It's a massively expensive permanent that says the next spell you play this turn is free. I think the massive cost of the permanent is an inflexibility cost, but it might not represent a cost in the same way as some other games, because the cost of spending at least 5 mana on a permanent is generally like that you get 2-0'd. And I think even though you can play one free spell immediately, you're probably getting 2-0'd when you play this. But if you spent turns 1 to, is it 1 to 5 or 1 to 6? 3 plus 4. If you spent turns 1 to 4 playing characters, fighting to win lanes, and then you take turn 8 to get double advance to develop a permanent, that's kind of the same as if you play the game on your first and second turns and then the 2 turns after that, but you had a gap turn for a 5-cost permanent. So I think high-cost permanents can be pretty good, at least relative to other medium-cost permanents. And I think that way of thinking about things would explain why we've seen Brassbook Hive be very successful, even though it's 6 cost. That was a card that was available in early spoiler season, has been played with a little bit more than a lot of these. I do think that the base set is not offering as many high-cost spells as we would like to see to try to get the most out of this. This could get way better as we get more cards. This makes the most sense in Akesha. It doesn't actually make the most sense in Aphanis, because in Akesha, you may be trying to set up scenarios where neither player is advancing with Off You Go and Vanishing Gate, and then in the really long game, you could want to reuse something repeatedly like this, and you could afford to get advanced on twice if you were preventing advancements in all of those turns. I'm going to give this a D because I don't think it will actually get played. I think it will not actually happen. It's very vulnerable to permanent removal. My actual prediction is that it won't happen. But if we compare it to the Ether Shard, I think the explanation for why you would want to play this card is way, way better than the Ether Shard. Because you're probably going to lose the same number of advancements. And let's see the rare. The next spell you play this turn is free. If you play it from your hand, it loses fleeting. I'll give this a D. I think the common version is probably going to be the one that gets preferred, because you're probably mana zoning this a lot, even in the decks where it is good. You have to mana zone it a lot, and you want your rares to be the cards you consistently don't have to mana zone, because you consistently get the rare point benefit you got out of it. And it's easy to maintain having lots of cards in hand as Yzmir. There's lots of deck building choices that you can make in Yzmir, like including Magical Training. Like, you can just play the second half of Magical Training to avoid running out of cards from your hand. If you have infinite mana from Kadagir, Yzmir, Bastion, but you only have the common. So that's the approach I would take instead of playing this version. Rare points are very precious. And if I can spend a rare point to survive until I can play the common Yzmir Bastion, that's a lot more attractive to me than having an even stronger game that like 3 O's instead of 2 O's, since a 3 O is not actually allowed after I start turns that begin with a Kekir Bastion in play. And this is Boom. Was that the entire... Oh, that's the entire first page? Or the entire set? Alright, that is all the spells and permanents. I will say that after fully rating all of them, the spell count was not super high for the cards that we're going to definitely add to our deck. So we may see that because Aphanis needs to get that spell count up, that some of the borderline spells actually are cards you want to play. Maybe you do play Intimidation. Maybe you do play Spycraft. I was close to believing in Spycraft. I like Spycraft a lot better than the draw 2 cards for 3. You may see those get played, just because of needing to have a certain account to play the game a certain way. I will add that as a footnote. But Akesha has no particular reason to have any particular number of spells. So for the way they were described for her, I would expect her to just play fewer spells if she's not interested in them. Alright, the next video will be either Axiom or Lyra. That's the only ones we have left. And thank you for joining me. We might go to Axiom next, because then we can jump from spells right to permanents. That would be exciting. Have a good night.